Welcome to the third video in our lesson on relating fractions, decimals, and percents. We just looked at changing percents to both fractions and decimals. So now we're going to go in the opposite direction. We're going to start with fractions and decimals and change them to percents. So let's start. To write a fraction as a percent, we're going to write it over 100 if possible, and then the numerator will become the percent. So for example, if you had 17 over 50, we can multiply this fraction by 2 and create an equivalent fraction of 34 over 100. Now because percent means per 100, this becomes 34%. Let's do some more practice of changing fractions to percents. In A, we have 19 over 25. To write this fraction over 100, we can multiply 25 by 4. So now multiplying 19 by 4 as well, we get 76 over 100, which is 76%. Now 7 over 10 can be multiplied by 10 to give us 70 over 100, which is 70%. Now for 129 over 200, to create an equivalent fraction over 100 here, we can divide by 2. So let's divide numerator and denominator by 2 to give us 64.5 over 100. Now as a percent, this would be 64.5%. Now let's change decimals to percents. We're just going to do the opposite of what we did when we changed a percent to a decimal. Meaning, we're going to move the decimal 2 places to the right as opposed to 2 places to the left. So if you had 0.27, moving the decimal 2 places to the right gives you 27%. So let's do that again. In A, we have 12 hundredths. If I move my decimal 2 places to the right, I get 12%. Now for B, if I move it 2 places to the right, I would get 70%. When you move it to the right and there's no numbers there, you just have to fill in any empty spaces with zeros. And for C, if I move that decimal 2 places to the right, I would get 3.5%. Now to go back to fractions for a second, if the fraction can't be written over 100, then it may be one of the fractions that we studied earlier in the unit. So let's say you have 1 over 3. I can't multiply 3 by any whole number to give 100. So what we can do instead is change this to a decimal. We know 1/3 is 0.3 repeating. So now that it's a decimal, we can easily change this to a percent by moving the decimal 2 places to the right. So if we do that, we would get 33.3 repeating percent. Now we have one more example combining everything we learned. In the first row, we're given the decimal and we got to convert that to a fraction of percent. In the second row, we're given the percent, and in the third row, we're given the fraction. So let's start with 0.3. As a percent, I can move my decimal 2 places to the right to give me 30%. Now I can take the percent and change that to a fraction by writing it as 30 over 100. Now reducing that, I can divide by 10 to give me 3 over 10. Now we could also have written the fraction from the decimal form as opposed to looking at the percent. Since the decimal is 3/10, we could have written 3 over 10 to start with instead of having to write it over 100. So you have various options here when converting between the different forms. Now for 95%, I can write that as 95 over 100. Now I can reduce by dividing by 5. If I divide by 5, I get 19 over 20. Now to go from a percent to a decimal, I need to move my decimal 2 places to the left to give me 0.95. Now for the last row, I have the fraction 1/5. 1 over 5 is 0.2 as a decimal. Now to write the percent, again, I have various options. I can just simply move my decimal 2 places to the right to get 20%, or you could take 1/5 and write that as an equivalent fraction over 100 and get 20% that way. So now hopefully you can easily convert between the different forms of fractions, decimals, and percents. You can now move on to the last video in this lesson.